At 9:53, I realized I wasn't being evaluated anymore. They were already rewriting my role as if I had never been part of the system at all. I arrived at 9:12. The elevator stopped on the 22nd floor with the same soft mechanical hesitation it always had, like it was deciding whether to let me out or keep me inside a little longer. The doors opened onto glass and white light. Northbridge Analytics always looked the same in the morning. Too clean, too precise. A space designed to make mistakes feel temporary and people feel replaceable. My desk was already aligned the way I left it the night before. Monitor angled. Keyboard centered. Not because anyone required it, but because deviation created noise, and noise was something I learned to eliminate early. I checked nothing. I opened nothing. I waited. At 9:37, the meeting started. The conference room filled without urgency. Chairs adjusted. Laptops opened. A projector came alive with the standard dashboard views. The kind that reduced months of work into shapes and colors that pretended to be objective truth. I took my seat in the same position I always used. Second row. Slight angle to the screen. Close enough to be visible, far enough not to dominate space. The first phase was predictable. Project metrics. Delivery timelines. Performance indicators. The room moved through them like ritual. Familiar language. Controlled cadence. Nothing unusual yet, but I had learned at the beginning of these sessions rarely mattered. What mattered was what changed midstream. At 9:41, I noticed the first deviation. A pause that lasted half a beat too long when my team's results were mentioned. No direct implication yet, just a subtle decoupling of tone from content. The numbers remained the same, but the way they were described started to shift. At 9:44, a second layer appeared. One of the managers adjusted the presentation sequence without explanation. My section moved forward. Earlier than planned. Isolated. Detached from surrounding context. This was not accidental. It rarely was. At 9:47, the focus narrowed further. Technical questions began to turn inward. Not toward the system, but toward interpretation. How certain metrics had been derived. Why specific models were chosen. Why alternative approaches had not been prioritized. The phrasing stayed professional, but the structure of the questions changed. It stopped being about validation and started becoming about justification. I stayed still. My hands remained folded on the table. My eyes stayed on the screen, not on the people asking. Movement would have signaled engagement. Engagement would have implied defensiveness. I had learned that silence often carried more weight when it was deliberate. At 9:49, the tone shifted again. The questions no longer targeted systems or methodology. They started circling attribution, decisions, ownership, responsibility for outcomes that were previously described as collective. I registered the transition without reacting to it. The shift was subtle enough that most people in the room would not consciously recognize it. But I recognized patterns faster than intent. That was part of my role, even if no one explicitly said it anymore. At 9:52, something changed in the room. It was not spoken. It was a release of pressure in posture, in breathing, in micro-expressions that accumulated into a shared permission. Someone leaned back slightly. Another tilted their head as if evaluating something already decided. A small smile appeared at the edge of a table, not directed at anyone in particular, but present nonetheless. The discussion had stopped being analytical. It had started becoming directional. At 9:53, the subject was no longer the project. It was me. The language stayed disguised. Still technical on the surface. Still framed as evaluation of outputs and decisions. But the structure beneath it was different now. My contributions were being separated from the system. My decisions were being isolated from context. My presence in the process was being reframed as optional. I did not move. I continued to observe the room the way I observed data sets that were about to break pattern. Not reacting to the noise, but tracking the point where noise becomes structure. The cameras in the room continued recording. Small black domes in the corners, always active, always ignored. No one looked at them. No one adjusted their behavior for them. That was part of the assumption. Recording without consequence meant absence of accountability. At 9:56, the discussion reached a density that made individual words less important than rhythm. Overlapping justifications, reinforced assumptions, a shared direction forming without explicit agreement. This was the moment systems often mislabeled as consensus. I opened my notebook, not the laptop, not the shared document, the physical notebook that sat to my right, unused for most meetings. Paper still carried a different kind of permanence. It did not update, it did not sync. It simply recorded. I turned one page. The motion was small enough not to interrupt anything in the room. I wrote one line. No explanation, no context, no reference to what had just been said. The pen pressed harder than necessary for a single sentence. Enough pressure to leave indentation on the page beneath it. I closed the notebook halfway, leaving it slightly open. Not hidden, not displayed, just present. No one noticed the change in my posture. No one tracked the movement of my hand. Attention in the room had already collapsed inward, focused on the constructed version of me that was now being refined through repetition. At 9:58, the discussion began to stabilize again, but not back toward the project. It stabilized around conclusion, around implied outcomes, around what would happen next, assuming the current framing remained unchanged. I understood what was forming. Not fully, not yet, but enough to recognize direction. I did not interrupt it. I did not correct it. At 10:01, the room started to relax. The intensity softened. Chairs shifted again. Laptops were adjusted. The sense of collective momentum settled into something that resembled resolution, but I kept the notebook open. The line I wrote remained the only trace of my participation that could not be filtered through interpretation or group consensus. It stood outside the system that was currently deciding what I was. At 10:03, the meeting began to move toward closure. The screen returned to summary views. The conversation returned to logistics. The shift was procedural, but the outcome of the earlier segment was already embedded. Nothing was formally decided about me. That was what made it irreversible. At 10:05, I closed the notebook fully for the first time since I opened it. The sound was soft, almost nothing. Still, it felt more final than anything said in a room so far. I placed it back on the table exactly where it had been before. No one looked at it. No one asked what I had written, and that, more than anything else, confirmed what I needed to know. Because in systems like this, the most important changes were not the ones that were acknowledged. They were the ones that passed through unnoticed. I noticed the change before I could name it. It did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as absence, distributed across systems that were supposed to remain stable. The kind of absence that does not announce itself, because it is built from removals too small to trigger alarms. At 12:03, I checked the internal project dashboard. My access was intact. My credentials were valid. Nothing visible had changed. But the surface layer of permission rarely reflected what had already shifted underneath. By 13:11, I started to see the pattern. My name was still present in documentation, but it had been moved, not deleted, repositioned. Sections I previously owned were now labeled as shared responsibility. Shared responsibility in systems like this rarely meant collaboration. It meant dilution. I recorded nothing yet. I only observed. At 14:18, the first failure appeared. I attempted to open a performance report that I had accessed dozens of times before. The system responded instantly, without hesitation. Access denied. No error details beyond a standard restriction message. No indication of who triggered it. No timestamp trail visible at the interface level. The denial felt procedural, not reactive. Pre-configured. Expected. I did not retry immediately. I waited. At 14:22, I checked another document linked to the same project layer. It opened normally. That contrast mattered more than the denial itself. It meant the restriction was selective, not systemic. Targeted. At 14:41, the second refusal arrived. This time, it was broader. A dataset repository tied to a parallel analysis stream. Previously unrestricted. Now inaccessible under the same classification barrier. The timing between restrictions was too clean to be accidental, too measured to be system noise. I stopped treating it as malfunction. I began treating it as structure. I opened a separate folder on my local drive, not networked, not shared. Isolated. A controlled environment where nothing could be overwritten without trace. I named it without labeling its purpose. At first, I only moved copies of documents I already had. Reports. Extracted data logs. version histories that I had stored automatically over months without actively reviewing them. The act was mechanical. No prioritization. No interpretation. Then I started adding what was not supposed to be centralized. Emails that had been forwarded to me indirectly. Notifications where I was copied but not addressed. Meeting summaries where my presence was implied but not required. Small inconsistencies in timestamps that most systems would smooth over, but mine preserved exactly as they were received. The structure of accumulation began to change what I was looking at. By 15.6, I noticed something I had not expected to see so clearly. The exclusions were not random. They were coordinated across different layers of communication. Access restrictions matched communication omissions. Removed visibility in one system aligned with reduced presence in another. None of it was explicit. None of it required direct authorization in a visible log. It only required alignment between people who did not need to write anything down. At 15.29, I pulled a version history of a critical document I had co-authored. The changes were minor on the surface. Formatting shifts, sentence restructuring, reordered sections, but metadata told a different story. My contributions had been redistributed across multiple revisions under different attribution markers, not erased, reassigned. The system did not delete authorship. It fragmented it. I did not respond to it. I copied the full version history into the folder. At 16.2, I reviewed communication threads that still included me. They were shorter now, more transactional. My inputs were acknowledged less frequently. When they were acknowledged, they were not extended. They were closed immediately after response, as if continuation had been pre-decided elsewhere. Something had moved upstream of me. Something I could not yet see directly. At 16.37, I compiled a timeline, not of events, but of removals. First access restriction. First omission. First reclassification of my work. First instance where my input was summarized instead of cited. Each point aligned with a subtle contraction in visibility. The timeline did not show chaos. It showed direction. At 17.11, I reached a conclusion that I did not document. This was not a failure in the system. It was a decision executed through multiple systems that were not required to acknowledge each other. The question shifted immediately. Not what changed, but who synchronized it. At 17.26, I checked my inclusion status in upcoming meetings. My name appeared in one. Tentative. Unconfirmed. The others were already structured without my participation. Agendas finalized. Ownership redistributed. My absence was now being formalized. At 17.58, I closed the folder briefly. The screen went blank for a moment. In that pause, I realized something simple. Nothing I had collected was hidden. It was all still visible, scattered across systems that assumed fragmentation would prevent reconstruction. That assumption was still in place. For now. At 18.14, I reopened everything. The structure was complete enough to function without me needing to explain it. It existed independently of interpretation. That was the point where collection stopped being reactive and started becoming preparation. Because the real shift had already happened earlier in the day, in places I had not been invited to see. The only remaining uncertainty was not what had been done. It was how many people had agreed to it before the first restriction ever appeared. 3 days later, the pattern stopped looking like noise. It started looking like behavior. I arrived at 7:58 and opened the system logs before I even checked my calendar. Nothing had been restored. Nothing had been corrected. The structure I had been tracking continued to evolve without acknowledging its own existence. At 8.3, the first inconsistency appeared in the financial forecast layer. A projection I had reviewed the previous evening showed a 2.4% adjustment in cost distribution. By morning, the official version reflected 3.1%. Not a large difference in isolation, but the derivation path had changed. Inputs that were previously weighted equally were now reassigned hierarchy. The formula remained intact. The logic behind it did not. I stored both versions. No notes, no interpretation. At 9:14, I checked the shared workspace for the project. One document had been edited without traceable attribution. The change itself was minimal. A paragraph restructure. A reordering of justification points. But the version history had been partially flattened. Earlier iterations were still technically accessible. But the comparison layer had been disabled. Someone had removed the ability to easily see difference. That was not efficiency. That was control. At 10:26, another shift occurred. A critical coordination file disappeared from the shared directory. Not deleted, not archived. Simply no longer visible through standard access routes. I confirmed its existence through cached references and indirect links. It still existed in fragments across dependent systems, but the central node had been removed. This was the first time I saw structure being broken intentionally rather than adjusted. I did not escalate it. I copied what I could still access into my isolated folder, the folder that no longer needed maintenance, only expansion. At 11:47, I mapped communication flow across the team. It was no longer symmetrical. Requests originated from fewer points than before. Approvals passed through a narrower set of individuals. Distribution of responsibility had started to contract inward. The structure was reorganizing into a funnel. My node was no longer part of the funnel. It was positioned outside it. At 12:33, I reviewed task assignments for the week. My name appeared in fewer entries. Some tasks that required my input were reassigned without substitution. Others remained open but unassigned, as if waiting for a decision that had already been made elsewhere. The system was not forgetting me. It was bypassing me. At 13:11, I detected another removal. A mid-stage analysis file vanished during active use, not after completion, during iteration. That detail mattered more than the loss itself. It indicated live intervention, not scheduled cleanup. Someone had access to the process while it was still running. I noted the timestamp. I correlated it with access logs. The same credentials pattern appeared again. The same entry point. Not random. Repeated. A single controlled pathway. At 14:05, I noticed something that did not belong in the pattern. The inconsistencies were not evenly distributed. They clustered around decisions that I had previously influenced. Not major decisions. Subtle ones. Weight adjustments. Model refinements. Interpretation thresholds. My involvement was being selectively erased from influence points, not outputs. That distinction changed the structure of what I was observing. At 15:22, I checked author traces across multiple documents. My contributions were still present in content, but attribution pathways had been diluted. Instead of single-source authorship trails, my inputs were now embedded within aggregated identity clusters. The system no longer pointed to me directly. It pointed through me. At 16:10, I reviewed the change control logs again. The same signatures appeared repeatedly. Not the same people necessarily, but the same authorization patterns. Timing alignment. Approval sequencing. Dependency chaining. It was coordinated through repetition rather than instruction. And it was consistent enough to be intentional. At 16:58, I reached the part that confirmed what I had already started to suspect. Every structural change, every removal, every reassignment followed a top-down flow, not in hierarchy labels but in execution order. Decisions originated in a narrow band of control and propagated outward through familiar intermediaries. The same intermediaries each time. No variation. At 17:21, I isolated the chain. It was simple once flattened. Too simple. One origin layer. Two transmission layers. One execution layer. Everything else was appearance. And within that structure, my name no longer appeared in any origin context. Not removed after the fact. Excluded before propagation. At 17:46, I opened the deeper data layer. It was not labeled as restricted. It was simply unlinked from standard navigation. A structure that existed parallel to the system I had been working in, but not integrated into its interface. Access required reconstruction rather than permission. I rebuilt the entry path manually. At 18:02, the layer responded. Not with content first, with absence. Entire segments of project history were missing. Not corrupted. Not archived. Removed from relational indexing. The kind of absence that only exists when something has been deliberately detached from everything that could reference it. I did not stop. I continued indexing what remained. At 18:37, a pattern emerged inside the deeper layer that should not have been visible at my level. Decision logs with synchronized timestamps across multiple departments. Overlapping approvals that bypassed standard escalation chains. parallel authorization tracks that never appeared in surface reporting. And at the center of it, a consistent exclusion marker tied to my identifier. Not active removal. Preemptive omission. At 19.4, I paused the extraction process. The structure was no longer just reorganizing around me. It had been designed to function without needing to acknowledge that I was ever inside it. The final remaining variable was not technical. It was temporal. When the exclusion began, and who initiated it before the first visible change ever reached my screen. 10 days after the first anomaly, I stopped treating the system as unstable. I treated it as intentional. I accessed the archive layer at 6:41, before the rest of the floor became active. The corridor lights were still cycling into full brightness. The building sounded empty in the way corporate spaces only do when they are not supposed to be observed. The archive interface loaded without delay. That alone was a signal. Nothing sensitive inside a controlled system should respond that cleanly. At 7.3, I pulled the earliest version of the project documentation. It did not match the current baseline. Not slightly, structurally. Entire sections that existed in the current operational version were absent in the original. And sections that no one referenced anymore still existed in the earliest file as active decision points. The system had not evolved. It had been rewritten. At 8.17, I compared 3 snapshots across different time markers. The pattern was not random revision. It was directional rewriting. Each iteration moved responsibility markers in the same direction. Not redistributed evenly. Not reassigned logically. Concentrated. Toward me. At 10.44, I found the internal changelog. It was not hidden. It was just buried under layers of access normalization. The kind of thing most users never think to open because nothing in the interface suggests it matters. But it mattered. Each entry carried identifiers that did not belong to the visible contributors list. Names that existed only in execution pathways, not in collaboration records. And some of those identifiers were not human-readable accounts. They were system masks. At 11.6, I traced one of the masked identifiers backward. It led through a chain of approvals that did not originate in the project team. It passed through operational management, then through compliance review, then into an executive decision layer that did not appear in any of the standard reporting structures. The structure existed parallel to governance, not outside it, above it. At 11.32, I noticed a shift in narrative consistency. Earlier versions of the project described uncertainty in outcomes. Later versions described controllable risk. Final versions described execution stability. The underlying data had not changed enough to justify the transformation in language. Only the framing had been rewritten. That meant interpretation was being controlled after the fact. At 12.18, I stopped analyzing outputs and started mapping responsibility flow. Every major deviation pointed back through the same corridor of approval. The same sequence of authorization nodes. The same pattern of final signatures. And in the middle of that chain, repeated across different layers of documentation, my identifier appeared, not as author, as reference point, as anchor. At 13.47, I realized what had been constructed. The system was not preparing to fail. It was preparing to explain failure in advance. Every revision, every retroactive adjustment, every reweighted decision tree was forming a narrative structure that would remain stable even if the operational outcome collapsed. And that narrative required a fixed point, a center of attribution. At 14.2, I ran a full export of the change network. Not selective, not filtered. Complete chain extraction from archive to execution layer. It was the kind of operation that normally triggers logging cascades across multiple monitoring systems. Nothing triggered. That silence was more informative than any alert. At 14.38, the export completed. I did not open it immediately. I stored it in an isolated container with no network linkage and no shared metadata reference. The kind of storage that does not announce its existence to anything else in the system. At 15.11, I reviewed activity logs around my own account. My access patterns had not changed, but correlation patterns around my activity had. Where I opened files, parallel access requests appeared from other nodes within minutes. Where I pulled historical data, mirrored queries were executed upstream. Someone was observing how I was observing. At 15.49, I identified the breakpoint. The moment the system stopped adjusting around natural workflow and started adjusting around my behavior specifically. It was subtle at first. A delay in access approval. A missing file that reappeared with altered metadata. A meeting invite that included me but excluded agenda ownership. Then it became consistent. Response to me had become reactive. At 1622, I confirmed the organizational shift. There were now two layers of activity operating simultaneously. The visible workflow and a secondary adjustment layer responding to my movements inside it. That second layer did not exist in documentation, only in effect. At 1658, I tested it. I accessed a neutral dataset unrelated to the project and modified my retrieval pattern. Within minutes, unrelated permissions adjusted elsewhere in the system. Not enough to block me, just enough to reshape adjacency around me. The system was not correcting errors. It was adapting to me as a variable. At 1733, I stopped testing and returned to the export. That was when I noticed the first anomaly in system behavior that was not technical. It was human, or at least, initiated by human observation. A permission audit was initiated on my account, not system-wide, targeted, quiet, structured as routine validation, but its timing did not align with standard audit cycles. Someone had noticed the absence of my reaction to the earlier changes, and that absence itself had become a signal. At 1804, I watched the audit expand. Access logs were being re-evaluated in real time. My recent queries were being cross-referenced with archival retrieval patterns. My navigation paths were being reconstructed as sequences instead of isolated actions. They were not checking what I accessed. They were checking why I accessed it in that order. At 1841, I closed all active sessions except the isolated container. The system continued to observe the traces I had already left behind. That was enough for it to reconstruct intent. At 1908, I realized the key shift. This was no longer about data control. It was about behavioral classification. And once classified, my actions no longer needed to be interpreted. They only needed to be anticipated. The export file remained untouched in isolation. But outside of it, the system had already begun building a second version of the story. One where I was no longer just a participant, but a defined variable inside a controlled outcome. 18 days after the first shift, nothing looked broken from the outside. The building still functioned in its usual rhythm. Meetings started on time. Reports were generated. Decisions were recorded with the same structured language that made uncertainty look like control. The system continued to present itself as stable. I arrived at 7:49 and did not open anything immediately. There was no need to rush. The change was no longer in progress. It had already completed itself elsewhere. At 8:22, I checked project status summaries. Everything appeared consistent at first glance. Metrics aligned. Deadlines held. No visible disruptions in execution. But consistency had become a signal on its own. When systems stabilize too perfectly, it usually means variance has been moved out of view, not removed, relocated. At 9:05, I accessed the full audit environment for the first time since the initial changes began. It loaded slower than expected. Not due to technical limitation, but due to volume. The system was not compiling a subset of changes anymore. It was compiling everything. Full reconstruction had started. At 9:41, I watched the first complete timeline render. Not fragments, not partial logs. A continuous chain from initial project definition to the most recent operational state. Every modification, every reassignment, every version overwrite aligned into a single uninterrupted sequence. Seeing it in full changed its nature. Individual actions no longer mattered. Only direction remained visible. At 10:18, the comparison engine finished processing. It took less than an hour to reconcile all versions of documentation across all storage layers. The result was not a report, it was a contradiction map. Every official version of the project diverged from the recorded meeting outputs at specific points, always in the same structural direction, toward consolidated responsibility. At 10:44, the first internal response layer activated. I saw it indirectly through access latency shifts. Systems that previously operated independently began synchronizing validation checks. Departments that had no reason to interact were suddenly reviewing overlapping segments of the same data. not because they were told to, because the structure required it. At 11:27, formal discussions stopped appearing in system logs. Instead, verification processes replaced them. No agendas, no meetings. Only checks, confirmations, trace validations. The language of decision-making had been replaced by the language of inspection. At 12:03, I observed something subtle but definitive. Names that previously appeared as decision-makers in approval chains were no longer consistent across systems. Some were missing. Some were replaced. Some were present only in historical references, not active validation paths. Authority was dissolving under consistency pressure, not removed externally, collapsed internally. At 12:36, I reviewed my own position in the reconstructed chain. It remained unchanged in output records, but in decision flow reconstruction, it had been isolated earlier than any other node. Not excluded at the end of the process. Excluded at the origin of interpretation. That distinction mattered more than anything else. At 13:14, I stopped focusing on individual changes. I started observing system behavior under full visibility conditions. The structure was now forced to account for itself. Every modification required justification across multiple layers simultaneously. Every justification required consistency with earlier versions that could no longer be overwritten. The system was now arguing with its own history. At 14:2, I noticed the first collapse in coherence, not failure, reduction. Certain decision paths could no longer be fully explained without contradicting earlier states. When that happened, those paths were silently deprecated. Not corrected, not repaired, simply removed from active reasoning space. The system was shrinking its own memory to maintain stability. At 14:47, I observed the secondary effect. As contradictions were removed, so were the people associated with them. Not physically, structurally. Their roles stopped appearing in reconciliation outputs. Their contributions were absorbed into aggregated summaries. Their responsibility markers flattened into generalized statements. Accountability was becoming non-individual. At 15:22, I ran a full integrity comparison across decision layers. The result was clear. The system had already resolved the contradiction before the audit began. Not by fixing it, by redefining what counted as valid sequence. At 15:58, I understood the implication. If the system can rewrite validity after execution, then investigation does not uncover truth. It only produces the final approved version of it. At 16:31, I watched as the number of active decision participants decreased again. Through reclassification, each cycle reduced the number of entities capable of making decisions, until only a few remained relevant. At 17:09, I checked the latest audit summary. The language had shifted completely. It no longer described events. It described convergence. A single narrative was forming from reconciled data. The system was no longer investigating what happened. It was finalizing what must be recorded. At 17:44, I closed the interface briefly. Outside, everything still appeared unchanged. But internally, there was no disagreement. Only resolution. At 18:12, I reopened the reconstructed chain one final time. My position remained intact, but context had fully settled. I was no longer part of a contested process. I was part of a concluded one. And at that point, the system no longer needed to decide anything about me. It only needed to preserve the version where everything was already decided. 3 weeks later, nothing reacted to me anymore. I arrived at 8:11 and noticed it immediately. The system no longer adjusted around my presence. It no longer tracked deviations. I had become part of history rather than process. At 8:15, I checked the final report. It had already been distributed. Several names were gone. My identifier appeared only as a reference point, not contributor, not decision maker. At 8:47, I reviewed it again. No correction followed. At 9:22, operations continued normally, but with reduced complexity. At 9:58, communication had become shorter, stripped of context. At 10:31, roles had been absorbed into generalized functions. At 11:04, audit trail and outcome were identical. At 11:39, I understood. The system had finalized itself. At 12:12, I stopped searching for inconsistencies. At 12:48, I returned to my workspace. Nothing reacted anymore. At 13:55, I realized truth here was what survived alignment pressure. At 14:33, my position remained structurally intact but context sealed. At 15:42, I closed all analysis layers. Everything continued without me. But the only question that remained was never answered in any report. Who decided I would not see it coming?